Okay. So, Mary, do you want to introduce Cassie?
Oh, Cassie, yes. I mean, we've tried, this is what, the third time we tried to get you on. And I heard originally the talk when Cassie did it as the very prestigious Rolt lecture at an AIA conference. But I gather that she's moved on and hopefully. I'm not sure what your current position is, Kathy. I know you've changed recently.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of a spiel when I start off and plug the new place. But yeah, this, for those of you who were at the Institute of Industrial Archaeology Rolt lecture, this is not exactly the same, but really very similar. So some of those faces that I can see today that I know have heard this once, so I hope it's as good in the second time round, and I hope you enjoy it. My work has moved on a bit since then. I've started looking at, I mean, to come out of the gutta-percha end of things, I've started looking at history of plastics and sort of very early plastics from sort of 17th century onwards, etc. So look out for a volume coming out on the archaeology of plastics. But I will share this with you today, which came largely out of the Scrambled Messages project. It was a AHRC funded thing through King's big interdisciplinary project. And this is from that. So if I just share my screen, everyone's seeing okay? Everyone good there?
Just a second. There we are.
Yay, well, that's all very good. So you need to see that, but I need to see my notes. So presumably you can still see my head and I can see my notes, yes?
Screen. So yeah.
Perfect. Great.
It's always a giveaway
Okay.
if you see somebody's PowerPoint.
So a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me, though I did spot a couple of students in the audience, which is lovely because that means they're paying attention to anything I say. Hooray! So my background is archaeology, and for the last sort of 15 years or so of that, I've been working on the archaeology of telecommunications. And so over the years, that's included mobile phones, early development of wireless, as well as overland and some submarine cable telegraphy. And the ideas I'm going to talk to you about tonight came out of somewhat my doctoral thesis, but also that Scrambled Messages project, which some of you will be familiar with, I know. As Mary said, I've recently moved. I was at Bath Spa. I've just moved to head up the new Cultural Heritage Institute, which I'll give you a little plug because it might actually interest some. So we're a standalone institute based in Swindon. So we're right next to English Heritage, to Historic England, to the National Trust. So it's a lovely little heritage hub. And we've got this really nice purposely refitted historic Great Western Railways carriage works building with its all mod cons, wonderful several million quid refit special for us. We're affiliated to the Royal Agricultural University's Land Management School, so it sort of follows on quite nicely from what they do in that department. And our current offer is MSc in Conservation and Management of Historic Buildings, in Cultural Heritage Management and in Archaeology. We're aiming to make these as accessible as possible for people that would like to come and do it, with entry requirements geared to people who don't necessarily have a first degree, but do have experience in the field. We offer everything from postgraduate diplomas and certificates to 6-year completely ultra part-time MSCs where you do one module over a whole year. And blended options, so all of our postgrad teaching can be in person or online. At the same time, we run all classes that way. We record all live sessions for students that need to do it asynchronously if they're working or have caring responsibilities. So the idea is anyone that wants to do it should be able to afford to do it and find time to do it. So if you are interested in anything like that, just give me an email. It's cassie.newland@rau.ac.uk, and I'm really happy to fill you in with any details. Okay, so the title of my talk tonight is The Tools of Empire, and I'm sure that many of you are going to be familiar with Daniel Hedrick's seminal work of the same name. It's published 41 years ago, and that it was the 40th anniversary for the AIA talk, which is why I'd chosen it as a title. And the book itself is, very wide-ranging, very ambitious, but to me, it's very much a book of its time. So in it, Europeans with their, innovative and entrepreneurial spirit use their technological advances to penetrate and conquer their colonies. And this is actually a direct quote. So these are Hedrick's works, and you can all see, we've moved on a while in 40 years to how we think about technology and how we think about empires. It's a very straightforward, but, rousing story of technology driving empire. And my problem with sort of how that plays out on the ground is that technologies seem to arrive fully formed in the world, fresh from the minds of their inventors and sort of neatly deployed to do jobs. But for me, that's not how I understand technology, and that's not really how I understand empires when you get down to the details on the ground. What I'm looking for is sort of, where's the experimentation, where's the messiness, where are all the failures and the happy accidents or the unhappy accidents? Where are the backstories? Where are the dodgy deals done? Where are the substitutions and adaptations and shortages? Where's the fraud? And what I think you lose from a lot of these kind of discussions of technology is the humanity. We're really lucky today in that we've got the successors to all these communications technologies that Hedrick's talking about, that allows us access to materials we wouldn't even have dreamed of being able to access in quite the same speedy and efficient way as than 40 years ago. We've got digitization of archives, we've got open access publishing, we've got things like Google Translate that can help us access texts in different languages. We've got Google Earth, we can fly around the world and look at sites. You know, there's so many amazing digital resources that have come out of it that actually it changes our whole approach to how you understand telecoms and how you understand empires. And so tonight I wanted to return to Hedrick's ideas, the ideas of tools and how they get created, but with the benefit of all of our new tools that have come out of them. I wanted to re-examine the relationships between empire and technology, between people and things. And I kind of want to loosen the sensible corset that often we think about technologies in and allow it to be a bit more human and a bit messier and just sprawl a bit more than it usually does. And I hope what I've ended up with is an archaeology that really sort of matters. And by that, I mean an archaeology that puts materials at its very centre. And so I begin the journey with a recipe for the Cape cable. It was made by Telcon, so the telegraph construction and maintenance company, which is right there in Greenwich. I don't know how many of you are actually in Greenwich, but it's the one at Enderby Wharf, so we were all very aware of it. It's made in the first few months of 1879, and it's funded with a very generous government subsidy, as it's designed to put London in direct contact with Cape Town in the hope of avoiding and preventing the Boer War, which is something it conspicuously completely failed to do, as history will tell us. And so what I started off doing was identifying the materials present in that cable. And so there's an 1877 quote from the catalogue of telegraph apparatus written by Ayrton, where he describes the build as a copper conductor, the insulator composed of layers of gutta-percha joined together with Chatterton's compound, a serving of jute, the iron or steel wire sheathing. So it's a very simple construct. There aren't that many ingredients, thankfully, in it. And the step I took with that was to try and work out in 1879, where would all these components have come from? Who would have made them or dug them or smelted them or harvested them? And I wanted to know what those industries looked like, what the workers' lives would be like, what that wider social, economic or political processes those materials and industries were caught up in. And so my plan was to trace a full life history of the cable from the raw material through to the manufacturing and the laying process, and then look at it in operation. And I was going to try and paint a networked picture. So instead of relying on sort of a single site or a single location, is instead going to follow the threads of materials wherever they led, sort of irrespective of national borders, irrespective of languages, etc. And so, as you can imagine, this ends up being absolutely massive. But what I'm going to talk about today is a bit more of a stripped down sketch of that wider landscape. And there's going to be lots missed out, but hopefully when the book comes out, you'll be able to read the rest of it. And that tonight you'll be able to get a bit of a flavour of the sort of quite complicated stories that are woven into this piece of technology. The first material I turned to on that lovely Ayrton recipe was copper, because I thought I knew quite a lot about copper, you know, background in industriology, I'll start with copper. Turns out I know none of the really useful stuff. It was just a bit of an eye-opener. I was like, okay, it's going to be like that. So this table is taken from Barton, which is a publication on mining in Cornwall, published 1961. And when you look up 1879, when our cable's being constructed, it's a really interesting moment in world copper ore production. So I was hoping to sort of go online, see where it was most likely to come from, make a decision, keep writing. As you can see from this table, sort of production from Spain, Portugal, Germany, and especially the US is going through the roof. And places such as Chile and the UK are declining. So our copper, looking at the numbers, could come from pretty much anywhere. And so the next job is to try and narrow down where. And the clues actually lie within that, the 1861 Mathiasson report, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which explained why, on paper at least, copper should be a much better conductor of electricity than it was measured to be in experiments. So Lord Kelvin had already standardized limits for impurities such as tin or lead, which had been reducing conductivity, but he was still completely flummoxed as to why copper still looked better on paper than in practice. And it was Mathiasson who discovered that the missing impurity was air, effectively oxygen, dissolved in the metal while it was molten and evolved into microscopic bubbles when the copper was drawn into wires. And so with this long-standing problem solved, some manufacturers completely retooled their factories and began making high conductivity copper wire specifically for the telegraph industry. Importantly for us, the origins, the supply chain, and the manufacturing centres of conductivity copper looked really quite different from the copper that was just made and drawn purely for its mechanical properties. The leading company that emerged in the new conductivity copper field was the Birmingham firm of Bolton and Sons, who retooled their whole Oakham works to start to produce high conductivity copper for the telegraph and burgeoning electrical industries. And because of their focus on producing high conductivity copper, Bolton and Sons sourced their copper incredibly selectively. They would only buy the best picked or selected bars from dealers like Logan's in Birkenhead. And when you rifle Logan's accounts, you find that Logan's in turn are importing their copper exclusively from Chile in the form of quality controlled Chile bars, copper bars which were smelted at source prior to shipping. So Chile had been exporting processed copper since the 1830s. Tree furnaces had been introduced from Swansea. In Chile, these were known as the English system, which I imagine really pleased the Welsh. But Chile exported around 400,000 tonnes of copper that year. So again, it was difficult to work out where the ore for the particular cable that I was looking at might have come from that 400,000 tonnes of copper over hundreds of thousands of hectares. So again, how would you work out where that comes from? Isotope analysis can match finished copper to an original ore, but it doesn't really help us because different kinds of ore are found in different layers in a mine rather than varying by region. So while you can say what layer and deposit it would be, it can't tell you sort of geographically where anything could be more detailed. So we're left with basically the historical record to interrogate. And as an archaeologist, I always find that slightly traumatic. I like there to be lots of nice material clues for me. But the historical record is really very good on this front. And although copper ore is exported from mines throughout Chile in the 1870s, the smelters established to process the ore for export actually only numbered 4, and there were 2 in the north and there were 2 in the south. And of these, the firms at GIHS and Tongoy, so that's in the north, were considered to be producing the Chile bars of the very highest quality, the Chile bars for export. Handily, both these smelters are owned by the Urmeneta y Errázuriz company, and an economic historian from Chile called Valenzuela noticed that GIHS in particular concentrates its efforts on supplying the highest quality bars. So if we take as read that Bolton and Sons were only using, as they claim to be using, the best quality Chile bars, then they were likely to be using those smelted by the Urmeneta y Errázuriz company at GIHS. And so I started looking at what life might have been like in GIHS. Smelting in Chile is a largely foreign-run industry. And if you look it up on the Consejo de Monumentos Nacionales de Chile, they refer to GIHS as an important colonia inglesa, or English colony. And as you can see here in the 1875 census, of the 2,076,000 odd people listed as living in Chile, 26,000 and a half, I guess, were foreign born. and that the British within that make up a very large contingent and include many skilled emigrants from places like Swansea and Cornwall who are quite enticed by the cheap sea passage and the abundant supply of really good quality ore, and actually the relatively high level of wages when compared with home wages at the time. So in an 1872 letter from the managing director of the works in GIHS, it describes the colony as numbering around 40 to 50 British workers, overseeing the running of the factory, and some 250 Chilean-born workers. So according to the letter, the British employees were lodged in excellent houses and received from £12 to £30 per month, according to their skill with coal. Labourers of the lower orders were paid less, around £5.50 per month. Water and medical attendance were provided free. And actually the water is quite an unusual comment to add, because most of their contemporaries at the mines, at the copper mines further inland, were actually paying upwards of sort of £1.12 for 40 litres of water, and they had to buy all their water from the company. So this is a pretty good deal. Remembering back to my dad telling me about when he finally earned £10 a week in 1950 or whatever it was. This is a pretty good wage really for the 1870s. And when you look at the site, mostly on Google Earth, it must be said, there is a massively European flavour to the whole area, which is obviously very unsurprising when you consider that, you know, GIHS is founded almost precisely for that purpose, to be a little European colony to run the copper mines. Residential patterns within the village appear to have been structured quite hierarchically, reflecting the socioeconomic status of the workers. In an article from Chile Ilustrado, it explains that 30 meduigas were established in the north of the village for the married Chilean workers, and about 100 yards towards the south there's another row of sort of good buildings for the British workers, who it claims are very numerous. And the mediagas were simple, sort of uniform row houses of dwellings of plastered timber or adobe walls with corrugated iron roofs. And though they sound really basic, and sort of when we look at them in the picture here, they all look a little bit on the rustic side, they're actually sufficiently well built to still be standing and in use. I mean, this is 3 decades after the copper for the 1879 cable comes out, but actually a lot of them are still standing today. When you look around GIHS, the streets hardly seem to have changed. They've been really well maintained in sort of 150 years. And I just wanted to take you on a little sort of Google Earth flying tour around GIHS, just so you can get a flavour for what's still there and how it feels as a place. And the whole little town is a protected national monument, every element of it from this period. So it's had the benefit of legislation for the last sort of 20 years, putting a cap, if you like, on development that would change that character. And it is amazingly well preserved, except sadly this building, which was the laboratories of the Armanesi Razores company, which was quite unusual for the town, a 2-storey building. And that made it all the way through to 2019 when there was a big earthquake and everything 2-storey basically fell down. So that was slightly sad, because when I first started working on this, it was there. And then by the time I got to the end, it was gone. I was like, oh, sad moment. But obviously when the smelters turned up, actually they turned up in the 1830s, Chile wasn't some kind of sort of tabula rasa. It wasn't empty space that Europeans could just turn up in and do what they like. And we can kind of see that if we flick back a couple of, it's quite a long way actually. When we flick back to the census data, we can see that it tells us who's native born and counts as Indians. So just get back on track. There are 40,000, in fact, listed on that 1875 census, though weirdly, they're not included in the native-born section of the census, because that's for, you know, people born to European parents but born in Chile. They get their own little section, which is somehow not native. It's just a way of keeping tabs of who we've got. Now, around GIHS, the people that have been appearing on that census are the Mapuche people, who've been continuously and fairly violently resisting European incursion since the mid-16th century. The Mapuche had long succeeded in sort of confining the Spanish to the centre of Chile, they kept them out of the north and the south. But from 1871, which is basically the exact moment that GIHS was founded, the Europeans have once again been starting to push back into Mapuche lands. And so conflict returns and this sort of constant low-grade war. by 1879, when the copper for the cable is being smelted, Europeans are pushing further and further north into the copper-rich Antofagasta region, which sparks the war with Bolivia and Peru, and it all gets very complicated. Guayacan at this point is kind of surrounded on all sides by conflict over land. So it's got all its lovely rich minerals, but Guayacan is sat sort of safely between all of the borders where it's getting very complicated in the very sort of heartland of colonial Chile. The Mapuche, who are forced from their lands, are subject to pillage. They're being decimated by things like smallpox and war and all these conflicts, and their numbers rapidly dwindle. And they drop further from those 40,000 shown in the 1875 census, reaching an all-time low of just 25,000 people just a handful of years later. And while it's a very tenuous process, tenuous sort of link, conductivity copper is actually a small but fairly integral part of European insurgency in the area. And the quality of those Chilean ores just prove a completely irresistible prize. And it sends mines and it sends armies marching ever deeper into Mapuche land. With all the spoils of the conflict, all the benefit being smelted by the British at the coast and then exported to do our amazing technologies that we know and love from Greenwich. So leaving copper behind and moving on to the next ingredient on Ayrton's recipe, which is gutta-percha. So gutta-percha, as many of you will know, is a natural tree sap, which is solid at room temperature, but becomes very moldable when you heat it. And you can work it into almost any shape. It also happens to be an excellent electrical insulator, impervious to salt water, to pressures and to the temperatures you would find at the bottom of the sea. So gutta-percha was discovered, and I hope you can hear the big floating inverted commas around the world, discovered by the British in 1843. And the reason it's a big floaty air comma is because obviously it wasn't. Gutta-percha has been in use in the regions in which it grows for traditional items like knife handles and whips and bowls for an exceedingly long time. And actually gutta-percha wasn't even new to England in the 19th century. There's a sample in John Tradescant's cabinet, so that's from the 1650s. As well as items, there's a sort of famously tough whip called the sjambok, which is, people always think of being South African, but actually is a Malay invention, which seems to have been exported from Malaya and available to purchase in London for decades before anyone had thought of gutta-percha for insulating things. But what does happen in 1843 is that gutta-percha is discovered by the Victorian intelligentsia. They caught wind of it and then immediately started writing histories about its epic discovery and handing out medals to each other all round. And it's a very sort of well-rehearsed hagiography that we have that stands as the historical record if you don't look too much into the materials. The first use of gutta-percha to insulate telegraph cables was made by Charles Walker. So he's the electrician to the South Eastern Railway Company. And in 1847, he'd made the first machine which could sandwich copper wire between two fillets, he called them, of gutta-percha, and sort of goes through a roller, has seams pressed down the sides. Doesn't work terribly well. Werner von Siemens is credited with insulating an experimental wire with gutta-percha in that year. Nobody actually knows quite the method he used to do it, but he laid a much better documented version across the Rhine in 1848, so the year afterwards. But the process that really ensured that the gutta-percha wonder stuff made its way into the cable industry was when a machine was patented by Charles Hancock of the Gutta-Percha Company, so a little bit up the road to you guys, in that same year, so 1848. And Hancock's machine managed to make a seam-free wire coverage because it used a process of extrusion, so everything was forced through a die to make a completely watertight seal. Now, the thing about gutta-percha trees is they will only grow on a really narrow strip of land, which encompasses the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, and all over the island of Borneo. Trees grow in the jungles on the alluvial plains, and they'll go a very short way up the foothills. So if you can imagine, that corresponds pretty much approximately to the pale green area on this map. So it's a very small growing area if you think of where that, if you put that on the globe, it is not a massive area. Annoyingly for British, only bits of the gutta-percha growing world that they had any kind of influence over on that Malaysian peninsula. The areas in the darker pink on the maps there. So up north, there's Penang Island and Province Wellesley, which sort of runs a little bit inland from Penang there. And you've got Malacca sort of in the centre and Singapore in the south. So it's a really tiny fraction of the potential growing lands that we have any kind of control over what's happening on. Now, in those alluvial plains, the gutta-percha trees grow to between 30 and 60 metres in height. They've got a diameter of between 1 and 1.5 metres. They're very slow to mature, and you can only collect gutta-percha from the tree once it's around sort of 30 years old. Now, the image I'm using here is obviously staged for the camera because that tree is far, far too small to be economic to cut. That would be a very pointless tree felling, but it's to sort of illustrate to the British what the process looks like. Now, the thing about gutta-percha trees at that point was they couldn't be tapped like latex, but had to be felled. And they were generally felled several feet from the ground because it's very hard to cut them off any lower using a billyon, which is the local tool that's the equivalent of an axe. And then you have to wring the bark, which is what the guys are doing here, wring the bark all the way around at intervals of 15 to 30 centimetres and allow the sap to run out. And then they would collect the sap in basically anything they could find. So coconut shells or leaves or little holes in the ground, all of these things have been used to collect the sap. Once it's out of the tree, the gutta-percha coagulates really quickly. And the vast majority of sap can't actually be drained from the tree. So every tree produces really little. And Tully, whose work we'll come back to in a little bit, actually estimates it can be as low as 11 ounces. So that's sort of 315 grams from any one tree, which is kind of a crazy number when you think about scaling that up to the tonnage we're working with in the cable industry. So as a method, this was a completely sustainable thing when gutta-percha was just one of dozens of locally sourced jungle products. But the increasing demand from the cable industry leads this really swiftly to becoming completely unsustainable. Collins, who's writing in 1878, estimates that British imports amount to 1.34 million kilograms in 1877 alone, which is approximately 4 million trees. And the crazily high prices that the material commands on the world market ensures that basically every gutta-percha tree is subject to a bounty. So it's driving collectors further and further into the forests until entire regions are completely cleared of the species, and it almost goes extinct at that point. Oxley notes that there's the almost complete elimination of gutta-percha trees from the whole island of Singapore by 1847. So that's 5 years after it's first discovered. That's the kind of a pace that the British and the Germans particularly go through gutta-percha. Cerulus, who's writing in 1891, reports the tree is extinct from Malacca and Selangor by no later than 1875, and from Perak by 1884. And so worries about exhausting this supply begin in the very early years of discovery and become a really common theme throughout. By the time we get to our cable being manufactured in 1879, Kew Gardens reports that the supply of gutta-percha from the British territories on Malaya are beginning to cease. And even when we expanded the Straits settlements in 1874 to include Pangor Island and the Ding Dings, so really expanding our sphere of influence on the Malay Peninsula, it didn't really make any difference to the possibility of getting hold of gutta-percha. And so the British started looking further afield, particularly to Borneo and Sumatra. And by 1879, 5 million trees were cut down for their gutta on the island of Borneo alone. And export exceeded 3,300 tons just from Sarawak on Borneo. So it's actually quite likely, looking at our dates, that the gutta for the Cape Cable didn't come from sort of the dwindling supplies that were being plundered on British Malaysia, but by a very informal trade network from the various sort of sultanates and Dutch-controlled territories of Borneo and Sumatra. The industry there is part of the traditional jungle products network. So indigenous hunter-gatherer groups who will be living very deep in the interior of the forests cut and collect the gutta. They pass on the raw products to the primary traders, who are sometimes sort of specialist members from the same ethnic group, but are much more frequently belonging to neighbouring indigenous groups who are closer to the rivers. So they sort of got the monopoly on transport, if you like. Those primary traders sell to secondary traders, which are on sort of the bigger settlements along the rivers or at the coasts, who in turn sell to tertiary traders in the major ports. So if you're thinking convoluted networks, that's what it means. It's changed hands so many times before it even gets to the ports that the British have no control over where it comes from or how much it costs. So at the ports, the tertiary traders are predominantly migrant Chinese. And they got into the jungle products business, mostly to trade things like sago and edible bird's nest, but when capitalising on the market price for gutta-percha, the boom of the cable industries. Now, the interesting thing about these jungle products networks is that they are a really sort of stark contrast to other cases of sort of colonial resource exploitation. There's no sort of obvious imperial centre that ruthlessly exploits resources of a colonial periphery. Rather, there's actually a great deal of autonomy. There's a great deal of flexibility and informality. There's no debt. There's no landowner. There's no coercion in the jungle products market, which is quite unusual for something being delivered in such bulk. The British or the Dutch or the Chinese or the Bruneians have little control of what goes on in the garden, in the jungles rather, or indeed in those smaller ports. The only time the British start having any involvement in the network is at the entry ports of Sarawak and of the Strait settlements, where they can just funnel that gutta-percha onto the world market. And the British were terrified. I mean, they're acutely aware of how little control they have over the raw material, and they worry constantly about it in all of the publications through the period. They attempt to fix it with economic botany. So that would be sort of the discovery and exploitation of exotic plants. And Kew Gardens ran an informal network of botanical gardens, which they established in British colonies around the world, where enthusiastic amateurs and local horticultural societies would ship promising-looking plant specimens to Kew, back with any sort of willing ship's captain. And they had a deal with the Foreign Office that they could have free transport for any plants, which is handy. And something like 10,000 specimens are shipped to Kew annually, just on an informal system. Kew then catalogue it and propagate it and experiment with it, and then send them out to the other botanical stations around the world to see what will grow well where. And it's how tea came to be grown in India. There's some really big success stories for the Botanical Gardens networks. There's some wonderful sort of archaeological materials that you come across occasionally if you're really lucky, and I'm showing one here which is a Wardian case, which is sort of a trunk cum cucumber frame that could be loaded on ships so that your plant will still get light and still have non-salty water in its environment, and you just close it down like a mini, which is a maxi bottle garden. And so they packed seeds of gutta-percha trees and saplings propagated by the thousands and stacked onto steamers and sent out to all the British territories in the tropics the world over. It was a very exhaustive process, but absolutely to no avail. It wouldn't grow anywhere except British Malaya, Sumatra and Java. And so the gutta-percha of the Cape Cable was part of a very steady and completely unchecked exploitation of wild gutta-percha supplies. There was no way of plantation growing it at this point. So next on Ayrton's recipe is Chatterton's compound, which if you do a little bit of research, you'll find Ayrton's written about that as well. So it's a compound that's used as an adhesive, invented by John Chatterton of the Gutta-percha Company, and it's designed to stop the layers of gutta-percha insulation separating from each other and sort of peeling off the copper core. It's applied by melting the compound down in sort of a warm bath, and then you can draw the various layers of cable through it during manufacture. It comes in the form of sort of a thick black stick that you could melt and use when you were jointing cable in the field. And in fact, if you go to France and ask for Chatterton's, they will sell you a roll of electrician's tape because that's what replaced it in France, and they kept the name, which I always think is a lovely little thing to be able to do. So the recipe for Chatterton's composition is 1 part Stockholm tar, 1 part resin, and 3 parts gutta-percha. So what I did was I broke this down into its ingredients and thought, okay, well, where's the Stockholm tar coming from? The answer you would hope would be Stockholm, but sadly it's not quite as interesting. Stockholm tar is just pine tar that happens to be exported by the Norrländska Tjärkompaniet, otherwise known as the Swedish Tar Company or the Stockholm Tar Company. So it doesn't actually tell you geographically where in massive Sweden the Stockholm tar might come from. So the Stockholm Tar Company had an export monopoly since 1648 for every barrel of tar produced in Sweden had to pass through Stockholm. And the barrel was branded Stockholm tar to prove that it had been through the system. And everybody hated this monopoly internationally. It meant that, well, 2 good things. You got good, consistent, high quality tar exported from Sweden, and you knew you were always getting good, high quality tar. So it's the first choice for sort of naval and military assets. But it meant that they controlled all the prices, so everything cost a fortune. So you got quality, but you paid for it. And that domination certainly continues in the market right well into the 20th century, when Gamble's writing about it in sort of 1921, about it being the first choice for all the industrial applications. But what else can we glean about it? Can we narrow it down at all? So the high quality of materials demanded by the cable industry gives us some clues again. Borgegard notes that industrial tar distillation began in Sweden around the mid-19th century, and so it would certainly have been in operation by the time we were looking at our 1879 cable. But industrial tar was considered poor quality, and Gamble again is noting in the 20s it's considered unsuitable for naval applications. So even at the turn of the 20th century, the export market, the telegraphic industry, the naval industry is continuing to insist upon what's considered the best quality tar, which is known as peasant tar. Peasant tar is produced using traditional methods, part of a sort of seasonal infield-outfield system of production. So in summer, arable farming took place in the infield lands, and they grazed their herds out in the forest of the outfield. Trees would be cut from the outfields and floated down the river to sell. But come winter, the herds were all brought back into the infield so you could make sure they didn't all die of exposure. And people turned their attention to digging out the pine stumps left from that logging industry. So I always think about, waiting till the ground's frozen before you try and dig out the roots of a pine tree. That sounds like hell on earth to me. But apparently it was because it's absolutely perfect for tar making. The roots hold the best, the best tar. And this process seems to vary very little by either region or antiquity. In fact, Willstrand argues that the method of production remained completely static from 600 onwards. The structures you can see on the slides here are called the Tardja, literally the Tar Valley in Swedish, often translated as Tardale for us, which obviously still makes sense to us. It's constructed around a trench dug into a slope or a hillside, with a pipe or a timber trough laid along the bottom to sort of collect the tar, and then a funnel-shaped pit is created either in stone or in timber over the top of the trench. You line it with birch bark or flat stones or something like that to stop the tar seeping into the ground and ensure that it runs down into the trench or the trough at the bottom. And so this creates really distinctive funnel-shaped earthworks, which you can find absolutely everywhere throughout the forest of Sweden, because obviously you do it wherever is near the roots. You don't want to be carrying that too far. And the pit is carefully stacked with stump timber, covered with peat or sometimes moss, and you smoulder it in a really even and controlled manner for about 9 days. And as the tar drips from the heated wood, it runs down the sides of the dale into the trough at the bottom, from where it's run into barrels. And the fire has to be kept to just a smoulder at all times, otherwise the whole dale, along with all the newly barreled tar, goes up in flames. And according to Willstrand, it's really not uncommon that someone falls asleep and doesn't notice they've got a quick burning bit, and up it all goes. So from absolutely start to finish, tar making is back-breaking labour. It's really intensive work. You're up all night watching the dale for 9 days, but it's absolutely crucial. And the reason it's crucial is the Swedish infield-outfield system is a largely subsistence one. Everything needed was produced on the farm, and only sort of a barter economy existed for the other things people wanted. And tar was one of the few goods produced by the system that could actually be traded for cash. So you had your lumber that could go down the river, and you had tar. And cash was the only thing that you could pay your taxes with. You couldn't pay your taxes in kind at all. You had to have specie. And so the infield-outfield system had to produce tar, because otherwise they couldn't pay their taxes, which turns tar making into a complete trap for the peasants making it. Unlike other crops, it's one of those products you can guarantee every winter, because every winter you can dig up a tree. It doesn't matter what the weather's been like, it's all fine. Which means that tar merchants were happy to lend money against future tar production. So if you had a failed harvest or a particularly lean year, you could get a loan from the tar merchant against your winter tar. And so once you got into that cycle of owing someone something and having to increase production to meet that debt, as you struggle to pay not only your taxes, but your debts to the moneylenders, you get a vicious cycle, which means the world's supply of tar is based on people that are very much caught into an economic system they can't get out of, digging up roots of trees from frozen ground. And if you think about the high-tech nature of telegraph companies and some of the naval applications for Stockholm tar, all of this is reliant on millions of indebted peasants toiling in frozen forests. And I always think it's a fascinating juxtaposition to put those two points next to each other. Now, our cable is made at the point in this cycle where it's reaching its logical conclusion, which is the traditional infield-outfield systems were being torn up and given over to a standalone economy of timber and tar because nothing else was paying. And the efforts sort of pushing further and further back into the forests of something like, I think Vilstrand gives 5 million tree trunks a year pushed back into the forests. So we sort of straddle that boundary. So while our tar 100% has to come via that process, we don't know if it's part of a subsistence economy or the move towards what would become the replacing economy, the industrial one that replaced the infield-outfield system. So I couldn't tell you which one our tar came from, which was very annoying. So in Chatterson's culture, we have rosin. There's another staple of the naval store industry, and it's derived from gum produced by the pine tree when it's wounded. And tapping of trees involves making sort of a deliberate cut in the bark, collecting the gum that drips out. And when you distill this gum, it breaks down into a lighter oil, which we call turpentine, which we're all very familiar with, and a heavier resin called rosin. And actually, rosin is just a corruption of the word resin. It means exactly the same thing. The gum is particularly plentiful and nice and free-flowing for tapping in the longleaf pine, which you may know flourishes in the southeastern states of the USA, or at least used to. They were referred to as the piney woods. And if you ever read sort of 19th century travel writing, people like Frederick Olmsted, who's writing 1856, the piney woods comprise the forest stretching from North Carolina through South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, a coastal band 60 to 80 miles wide. Some in the region of sort of 60 to 70 million acres. So this is a huge, not quite monoforest, but the trees and longleaf pines are very, very abundant. So though all the southern seaboard states are thickly forested, it's North Carolina that dominated the rosin and turpentine industry, and there's two reasons, both of which stem from slavery. The first is that the land in the more southerly states is generally worked for profit. In South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, forests are logged and cleared and turned over to the raising of plantation crops, such as cotton and rice and tobacco. Much of the soil in North Carolina was unsuited to this, though, and that profits were more easily found in turpentining. The second factor was that prior to the Civil War and the subsequent abolition of slavery, 35% of North Carolinian families owned slaves. And it's this unfree labour that allowed a fairly precarious and labour-intensive turpentining industry to become established in the first place. Early on, turpentining is very much small scale. It's a local affair. Lots of poor white farmers living in rickety farmsteads with a handful of slaves, growing things like peas and beans and making a bit of cash by collecting gum and selling it on. In the decades after the Civil War, turpentine workers are likely to have been ex-slaves, or to cover the inevitable post-abolition labour shortages in the tough industry that turpentining is, leased convicts. So there's lots of prison labour being used at this point too. And given the state of the criminal justice system, where a black person could be imprisoned for vagrancy or running a boxcar, the groups are often the same people. The ex-slaves are the same as the convicts. So ultimately, it's they're still getting their labour from the system even after slavery has been abolished. Very piecemeal picture, lots of small producers, no one making piles of money by any means. The description of gum collection and distillation is taken from that Olmsted travel journal, which are written 1856. The descriptions would still appear to hold in the 1870s because, as Outland notes in 2004, gum harvesting not at all. Tools and equipment remained the same. Boxing axes, hacks, pullers, dippers, scrapers, and stills were neither improved nor replaced. So we can be fairly confident this is a reasonable description of what's going on. So November to March is spent boxing. That's cutting sort of an angled hollow at the base of a pine tree that contains sort of 1 or 2 litres of the gum. Large trees might have 3 separate boxes cut into the base, sort of at angles around the base. And it's a job that requires quite a lot of experience because you've got to judge the angle of lean, you know, where's the gum going to run down the trunk? You've got to know about predominant weather conditions. You've got to be able to deal with uneven trunk shapes, etc. So it's not sort of a skillless labour. You then corner the boxes, little triangles cutting in so that you can channel the gum into the boxes. And then you would chip the tree at intervals by cutting away a strip of bark every year, a little bit more above the box to encourage more gum to run down the face of that tree. And older trees that have been chipped for a long while might be chipped to sort of 3 meters or more. You'd be up your ladder doing the next year's chipping. Once the gum were collected in the boxes, you could use a ladle called a dipper, as in the Big Dipper, the stars in the sky is named after the turpentining ladles, where they were transferred into barrels for transportation. And that's what you can see the guys doing here in the foreground, putting their dipped gum into the barrels. And in December and January, when the sap stopped flowing, you get the scrape, or the gum which had dried on the face of that tree, that had to be hacked off and collected for separate processing. When you'd finally finished with a tree, it would be felled and sold for lumber or used to produce low quality tar, but the longleaf pine isn't particularly great for tar. So for much of the summer, there's a big army of chippers and dippers living out in the pines, and every worker was responsible for a certain area that might contain sort of several thousand trees, and they would move around them all day, chipping and scraping. And to do this, they built temporary lean-to structures in the forests, which could be broken down and moved on to follow the work as you moved through the trees. Provisions such as food and water were transported to camps from the distillery settlements. So they send the wagons in with the food and out with the gum, and that would be the way they keep the transport working and the barrels moving. But they're very, very often insufficient for the number of people that are living out there. And so both Olmsted and Outline note that wild game is a really important food source for the people living out in the pines. It's a really odd lifestyle. The main thing people are missing in the summer months is water, and they had to rely largely on rainwater that would collect in the turpentine boxes, so it would float on top of or underneath the turpentine, and they'd have to get it out with their dippers, and it wouldn't be particularly pleasant. So not a great environment to work in, almost worse than digging up the roots in Sweden, but possibly not. The landscape of turpentine was extensive, hundreds of thousands of boxes in production at any one time. Wildfires can do a great deal of damage to a box tree because obviously it's not got the bark to protect it. And much of the chipper and dipper's time is devoted to clearing vegetation and fallen debris under the trees so that the fires don't spread. But it also makes it easier for the workers to get to the trees to chip and dip them if you keep the brush down. And sort of third useful thing is you can get carts in. So if you keep the brush down, you don't have to carry your barrels quite so far. Now, haulage costs kind of shaped and constrained the whole industry because the barrels of gum had to be moved as quickly as possible to the distilleries to avoid a drop in quality. You know, if they get hot or shaken, it's much harder to process. So distilleries are centrally placed within turpentine orchards, and you'll not find one that's more than 30 miles to a major road or railway or river because they just simply can't get it there quickly enough. Around each of the small distilleries, which you can see sort of on this slide here, the lovely Wheatstone stereoscope slide, just sort of point that out, would be a cluster of a dozen or so sheds and cabins, and several would be given over to coopering, so barrel making being constant necessity, whereas others would be used for stabling for horses or storage or to house the overseers and the stillmen and the coopers. And the gang just to a certain extent also got proper accommodation. Distilleries, you can always tell them because they're built on sloping valley sites and they need very plentiful water to keep the boilers firing up. Generally 2-storey structures housing a brick-built furnace vented with a lovely brick chimney. It gets loaded via a ramp into the still head on the 2nd floor, so it's all rolled up to the height, and then gravity is used for the process. A condensing tank, which is generally a large barrel with a spiral condensing tube or a worm, as it's called, is fed by a wooden launder. So if you look top right in our picture, that's the wooden launder feeding the condensing tube. The distilling process took 2 to 2.5 hours. At peak dipping season, you might fire it 3 times a day. It's that kind of volume coming through these places. You would boil off the turpentine at about 300 degrees, which would be decanted into barrels via that condensing coil. And then the rosin is what remained in the still. So while it was still warm, you'd call it to sort of molasses consistency and then run it out and pack it into cheap barrels. They didn't have to be decent because it was so thick and not run, it would set nicely and you'd be able to transport it. By the time we reached the 1860s, prices for rosin were through the roof. It was another one of those materials that had been discovered, and it was good for making soap and varnishes, adhesives, inks, as well as cables. And so as the exhausted turpentine forests in North Carolina were felled, the search for fresh longleaf pine pushed ever further south. And the railways were instrumental in this. And the new lines, coupled with the opening up of new naval stores ports, such as this one at Savannah, Georgia, allowed the southern expansion of turpentining. And it was these newly established plantations in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and in particular Georgia, which rose to fill the demand for rosin from the late 1860s. So that's the kind of areas we are looking at. The new plantations emerging in the south are, well, they were very different to the ones in the north. They're much larger, they're industrialized, they rely really heavily on convict leasing, indebted labor, and other sort of exploitative systems of peonage, such as I owe my soul to the company store. It's all that kind of thing. That's where these ideas come from. And they're a really far cry from the informal haphazard arrangements from the backwoods in North Carolina. And when you look at the images coming out of these turpentine camps, documented by the likes of Zora Neale Hurston and Dorothea Lange, they're the same images that were shocking the world in the 1930s. And so our 1879 Cape Cable straddles the old and the new worlds of rosin production. The rosin used in the cables is just as likely to have originated on private lands of a poor but free white North Carolina smallholder as it is to have come from the dipper of an exploited ex-slave in a Georgia turpentine camp. Rosin also comes with other costs. So when turpentining began in the 1840s, the 4 to 5 million acres of longleaf pine forests seemed kind of endless. It was cheaper to abandon a turpentine orchard after 15 years and buy an extra strip of forests than it was to maintain it. And so orchard owners just headed south. And abandoned orchards with their trees stripped of bark, they perish by beetle, they go up in flames, or they're logged, and the bare plains are turned over to farming. So by the 1890s, there's less than 10% of that original forest remaining. Turpentining basically brought the demise of the piney woods. You couldn't walk through them now, there's hardly any left. And what it left in its place is the wiregrass states. So if you ever hear that term, it's entirely down to the turpentining industry that that landscape exists. Last on our natural materials list is jute. So jute is a bast fibre, which means it's got long fibres growing in a layer just below the outer bark. And you can make it into very useful textiles. In the UK, we call it hessian. In the States, it gets called burlap. The jute turns out to be an amazing insulator. It's resistant to salt water. It's a good insulator, and it's perfect for cable construction. You can find it growing throughout India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, etc. It grows best on the plains of the river delta, such as the Bay of Bengal, where the lands get really moist and fertile by monsoon rains. And so it takes about 4 months for an adult jute plant to look like this, and it's about 3 meters to give you a scale of how those plants are when they're growing. They're an amazing forest. None of the images I'm going to use here are 19th century in date, which is really annoying. I've found it almost impossible to find any sort of visual recordings of the jute retting process any earlier than 1900. And so these are from 1900, and I think some of the very later ones, no, they're all from 1900, thinking about it. So I've used them anyway to provide history. We know that certainly by the 1970s, a lot of the photographs still look the same as this. So, again, making a bit of an assumption that the process hasn't changed too much and hoping they're representative enough to be useful. So the initial processing of jute stems to get the lovely fibre out is really simple, but really labour intensive. So you cut the plants by hand and then tie them into bundles, and you can see the sort of 20 stems per bundle behind them there. Submerge these bundles in rivers or ponds. You sort of hold them under the water with logs or stones because it gets the anaerobic rotting process, if you like. It's called retting, and where bacteria break down the bonds between those long fibres and between the bark and the fibres, and lets the fibres float free. And this takes between sort of 2 weeks and 3 weeks. And then if you can whack the stems on the water, or you can whack them with a hammer, it looks a bit like a cricket bat in that guy's hand there, which allows the workable fibres to be stripped out from the remainder of the stem. You've then got a lovely sort of flowing fibre that you can tie in bunches and dry. And archaeologically, these are sort of specially constructed bamboo frames, which you won't find any evidence of, or they get dried on fences and house roofs. You bundle the fibres up, send them to the mills. There are local dadans, or the middlemen, who would turn up with their wagons and load them high and take them to places like Calicut to have them further processed and woven into various grades of textile or turned into rope or twine, etc. So we're most interested in terms of cables, in terms of jute twine, but sometimes you do see tar-soaked ribbons of woven jute used to sort of protect the outside of armour cables. It does get used for more than one purpose. By far the largest market for jute is packaging. So in the 19th century, instead of pallets, you basically had jute wraps, and it was used to export everything: cotton, tea, grain, cement, cloth. Everything was wrapped in jute. It's sort of our shipping container, and you couldn't really send anything without jute. And so there was huge global demand for jute that far outstrips what the cable industry needed it for. But it led to a really odd sort of quirk, if you like, in the world market for jute, whereas fully processed jute cloth or jute twine was treated legally as a raw material. If you tax jute, you tax every industry that relies upon jute. And so when your cable companies are buying it in for quite a specialist purpose, they're getting a real bargain because of this tax status it has internationally. But that does mean you have to keep cost of production to an absolute bare minimum. So it keeps profits low. And because profits are low, it discourages foreign investment. So there's no point to the cable companies want their own jute plantations because they can get it so cheaply. So you don't get any plantation systems. You don't really get local entrepreneurs sort of pulling together and consolidating small holdings. This is very much family-run, family-staffed business. And when there's global demand fluctuations, just either more or fewer of the peasant workforce turn to jute to subsidise their incomes. When the prices are low, they just don't bother doing it. So it's this really wonderful example of a flexible system that kind of, again, escapes sort of colonial overseeing. And I think that's an amazing thing, again, in colonial markets. And there's a nice quote from Finlow, who's Director of Agriculture in Bengal in around 1904, who notes that the subsequent huge world demand for raw material was met entirely by the ryots of Bengal working small plots of land. And so this stands in quite stark contrast to other high demand crops of the era of other European empires, such as tea and coffee and cotton and sugar, where it all moves over into large scale farming. But jute remains entirely a production of peasant labour. And so if you look at the landscapes of jute in Bengal, it's a patchwork of small fields based around family settlements, all of which have access to water because everyone needs to rep their crop. And this can take the form of, floodable paddy-style fields, or it might be hand-dug ponds or ditches, or just using a natural watercourse. It's a very much a retained traditional family way of life, and these guys have control over their means of production. Profits were low by colonial standards, so put off investment, but for the ryots, it represents a really good living. And so Hashmi describes indigenous attitudes to jute, saying that the ryots regarded jute as a wonderful crop, as they could afford all the luxuries of rural life. And then the economist Goswami gives us some more detail, saying that after selling their jute, they covered their roofs with tin, dug ponds, and spent money on fireworks and feasts to greet their new daughters-in-law. And so jute might not have afforded ryots what would be regarded as a prosperous colonial lifestyle, but it did enable them to live in a comfortable and independent manner. They weren't, as Bengali post-colonial theorist Chakrabarti observes, imperial subjects subsumed within an imposed capital system. So now we have materials landscape. That's everything that goes into that recipe. So each of those items has its own biography, its own history, and its own wider social context. And as I've plotted on this map here, each of them makes their own journey to England to become the Cape Cable. So on this slide, I always think a bit about EastEnders. It leaves me feeling like da na 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 na. But actually, there's a really good reason for it, which is so much of what we think of as the East End is founded by the cable companies. So this is a map of Greenwich, West Ham and Woolwich from 1805, which I know you'll all have seen before. And the bits we're interested in here are in red. And the thing I'd like you to note is that they're pretty much empty. There's an old brick field, there's some medieval drainage ditches. There's not an awful lot there in those marshier areas. And then suddenly this happens. Between 1852 1879, no fewer than 6 brand new cable companies all move into those empty bits of marsh. You've got Hooper's in Millwall, Glass Elliott and Telcon in East Greenwich, India Rubber, Gutta-percha and Telegraph Company, and Henley's in North Woolwich, and Simon's directly opposite in Woolwich. The docks are filling out a bit on the Isle of Dogs, but otherwise to the east, every new enterprise on those foreshores is a cable company. And that's because the area is perfect for several reasons. First, cable manufacturers have a voracious appetite for land to store raw materials, to house engines, to deal with boilers and heavy plant, to accommodate numerous workshops, and of course to house the many massive seawater tanks in which the cable is tested and stored before shipping. Cable manufacture also requires good sea and rail links for delivery of raw materials and for the loading of cable onto the cable laying ships. And the marshes offered the potential for extensive wharfages and had previously been connected to the wider railway system by the Eastern County Thames Junction line in 1846, mostly to bring in coal. So there's all sort of set up and ready to go there. But there's also a third, slightly less salubrious reason why West Ham marshes particularly were so tempting. If you think about the early cable ship companies, they've got sort of very smelly vats of hot tar, they've got heavy machinery, they've got lethal belt drives, they've got smoke belching engines, they've got fire risks, they're fairly heavy polluters. So for example, in 1887, the factory at Silvertown there housed 47 steam engines and 31 boilers. You know, they're fairly energy intensive places. And in West Ham, as Powell notes, the usual regulations on pollution, on fire prevention, on the protection of workers were historically not enforced. You could famously get away with pretty much anything there. And handily, West Ham also fell just outside of the geographical scope of the Metropolitan Act in 1844, meaning it enjoyed all the transport advantages of the City of London without actually being constrained by any of the same safety laws. And so the booming cable manufacturers attracted and in some cases imported people to the area. With them came the need for infrastructure, housing, roads, utilities, ferry landings, docks and railway stations, pubs, shops, churches and schools all grow up around the cable factories to service the inhabitants. Related industries such as village firms, foundries and coal merchants followed. Greenwich, Hallsville, Beckton, Lighthouse, East and West Ham and North Woolwich, settlements sprang up, sprawled and merged to cover the marshes within just a handful of years. The East End was born and the germ was provided by the cable industry, which set that landscape pattern from its inception. Now we're now at a crucial juncture. On the 8th of April 1879, all the cable materials have been brought from the steamy jungles, frozen forests and parched plains around the world to Telcom factory at Enderby's Wharf. They've been variously macerated, extruded, rolled and entwined into 3,852 nautical miles of serpentine cable, sitting in those large brine-filled tanks. It's a Tuesday. Now, I hope you don't mind, but I'm not actually going to go into the cable manufacturing process, as they're really very well known and well documented by many of us sitting in the rooms today. Instead, I'm actually going to dive off into the larger and less well-known aspects of this cable's journey as it sets forth into the world. So back to the dockside. The last of the Cape cables being coiled at a rate of 5 miles an hour from the briny tanks at Enderby Wharf into the bows of the SS Kangaroo. And tonight the ship will slip her London mooring and steam to Natal Bay in modern-day Durban. Now, the Kangaroo didn't just carry cable, but also every item which could be required for the project. So the sounding apparatus to find the route in detail, the testing equipment to monitor it, grappling machinery to rescue it when it all goes wrong. It carried all the underground cables, the equipment and the batteries for the shore station at the other end, plus everything that you require for daily life, both on board and at the destination, right down to like brooms and beds and pots and pans. It even carried the buildings that are going to become stations themselves in form of prefabricated flat pack structures. So the Kangaroo sort of holds the entire Cape cable system, if not in potential, then at least in boxes. And every detail of her journey is recorded by Captain John Seymour in his remark book. We read that the ship proceeded across the Bay of Biscay in a gale, which is the traditional beginning to any sea adventure. They filled their cable tanks with water as they passed Gibraltar to keep it cool. They stopped at Malta to take on coal, reached Aden via the Suez Canal where they took on more coal before taking detailed soundings from Aden to Durban so that when they laid coming back up, they'd know exactly what the seabed looked like. And while Seymour's notes are quite perfunctory, they do really open a window into international maritime infrastructure. So you've got the lighthouses, the signals, and the channels that are needed for the cable industry. Coaling, for example, is the backbone of the steamship world, and so large ships such as the Kangaroo require large amounts of coal to be stored in convenient locations. And you need a ready supply of stevedores who would like to balance precariously on gangplanks and service your boat. So freedom of the seas and of the cables really rests with control of these strategic positions on the land. And both Malta and Aden were territories that were ceded to the British in the first half of the 19th century and a pivotal infrastructure in the region, particularly after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. So 26th of May, after an uneventful journey, the Kangaroo arrives in Durban to discover the cable contract has been repudiated. So Seymour writes, they sit at anchor off the bluff for 40 days, doing nothing but rolling and tumbling about. And this seems an extraordinary way to run a business. But it reminds us that before the coming of the telegraph, all negotiations were conducted at the speed of the fastest ship. The chief shows he has other ideas about contracts, and he sets about the project on shore without a signature anywhere. And on the 3rd of June, he writes that they found a suitable landing site for the cable and a site for the station. And he then employs a local builder to construct the Durban cable house and prefabricate a second flat-packed cable house for shipping to the next planned system station up the line, which is going to be at Delagoa Bay, which is now in Maputo, capital of Mozambique. The landlines are erected between the telegraph office and the new site, and a trench dug down to low water mark to take the cable. And on Monday, the 30th of June, they finally get the go ahead to lay the cable proper. Hooray! It goes very smoothly. 150 fathoms of Type B cable arrives by rowing boats and is installed and buried for the shore-based section. And 3 days later, the heavily armed shore end is brought to site by Forerunner and sits at anchor outside the surf, shooting rockets and pulling cables, and it's very exciting. It takes exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes after sitting at sea for 40 days waiting for the chance. On Thursday, the 10th of July, the Kangaroo raises her anchor, sets off to lay the Cape cable going north. Now, I went to Durban to try and find the site of the Cape cable, the Durban cable house. This is the same view with the spit a little bit larger, taken in 2007. And excitingly, the cable house is under a car park. Yay! What I've been really hoping for is to find sort of the more telltale materials of destroyed cable houses, because they're really specific. So I found these in Cape Town, and I'll show you them anyway, even though it's not technically part of the same cable. So you see lots of brick and tile fragments, bits of rusty equipment still anchored into it. And you get this amazing, really diagnostic stuff. It looks like sort of a spongy concretion, and it's where the iron and the gutta-percha of the cable coils have been degraded by rocks. Makes this amazing sort of rock hard to touch, and it just sort of flows all over everything and sets. But as it was, I just got a car park, so never mind. In Delagoa Bay, early days life would have been a bit basic. This building here is what I've identified as the prefabricated flat pack station. It was built in Durban, then transported to Delagoa Bay. The prefabricated buildings that ship on the Kangaroo from the UK seem to be these kitchen units, which suggest that catering for those working at the stations was organised communally rather than being undertaken on an individual basis. And the photographs also contain some important details for understanding what daily life might have been like. So we can see the storage tank and rainwater collection system on the end here, which reminds us that cable sites need to be largely self-sufficient in even the most basic of commodities. And we see scattered around the site, especially sort of back right here, are barrels testifying to bulk storage of staples and mail, actually, and hinting at sort of likely large intervals between supply ships. To the rear of the kitchen on the left, you can see in the shade of the tree, there's an outdoor workshop with a workbench and a brazier and anvil, and they're all larger than you'd expect in a cable jointed kit. And so this is likely to relate to maintenance of buildings and machinery on site as well. And in the far background on the right, only sort of half in shot in that top right-hand corner, is a traditionally constructed round hut made from local materials, which sort of alludes to relationship between station workers and local population that's quite often left out of these images. It looks very much like an on-the-fly kind of temporary phase of cable work. Next phase completely different. So this is Cable Half Mark II under construction at Delagoa Bay in 1881. It's a much grander veranda-wrapped building. Really interesting to see the local labour down the front, male and female, all working on the construction of the building with the European guys who've turned up. And finished, it tells us so much about the differences in lifestyle experienced by the men at the neighbouring stations. So in Durban, their cable house is small and the employees are lodged in town in the nearby city. But in Delagoa Bay, everything has to be provided for the men who lived and work on site. And this makes a certain amount of sense because Delagoa Bay a major program of expansionary public works. So the hospital, the jail, the church, the cable station is very much part of this phase of infrastructure investment, meaning that the town is under construction around it. So life is a bit more insular. It's got extensive gardens. It has a farm with cattle and chickens. There's a young calf in that image, suggesting animals are kept for milk as well as meat. Accounts in the telegraphs suggest that all the land to the rear of the station was reserved for fruit growing and vegetables and herbs. Another clue is the dovecot set on stilts in the garden behind the cable house, which gives you a handy supply of fresh protein if you're sort of more dependent on supply ships or unfamiliar with local cuisine. The photographic evidence from the Telecom archive might suggest that Delagoa Bay is really isolated, like astronauts setting up a lunar base. You know, they carry everything they can possibly need with them. But actually, it sounds to me that this is a bit misleading because Delagoa Bay is a thriving trade hub at this point. There's all the goods from the interior being traded to the ships waiting at the coast. It's a very cosmopolitan place. So Jenkins notes that the makeup of the population is a steady 1/3 African, 1/3 Asian, 1/3 European throughout the whole of the later 19th century. And African faces sort of captured in those electric telegraph company photographs engaged in building work on gates or just sort of hanging out on verandas testifies to a much closer relationship between immigrant station staff and people. These fleeting images speak of an integration which is, very quotidian, but doesn't really come out much in the documentary record. The kind of isolation experienced by the staff at Delagoa Bay seems to be much more defined by access to European-style materials, whether this is food or furniture or manufactured goods. Delagoa Bay is only actually isolated in terms of trappings of Victorian life. The self-sufficient station concept, the design, the operation, it's all a sort of an exercise in keeping up appearances, those approximations of expected materials, a lifestyle fortification, keeping the native out, if you like. So in 1879, the settlement is poised to become a boom town. 2 years previously, the British annexed the Transvaal to get the gold directly inland of Delagoa Bay, and plans are afoot to develop it into a really important port, which it becomes as Maputo. So the cable station is not simply an outpost of informal British trading empire, it's a material vanguard. It's a piece of vital infrastructure, which makes the annexation of the Transvaal possible. And actually, after the 1884 Conference of Berlin, where they established the principle of effective occupation, the existence of physical infrastructure like a telegraph line and the stations becomes an important way of materially demonstrating that you are occupying a territory. So when it comes to claiming African land, it's much better to stick a telegraph pole in the ground than a flag. There's so much more we could talk about, and obviously I've had to leave so much out. We could talk about development of the first synthetic plastics. We could talk about PR role of the new cable through the Zulu Wars. We could talk about the constant battle between the repair crews and the Teredo worm. It was out of action about 80% of the time, as far as I can work out. Or we could talk about the global spread of football following the cablemen down the coast. We could talk about international students training at Porthcurno, or we could talk about the fine collection of Swahili ceramics amassed by the engineers on the coast. And that's kind of the problem with projects like this, with archaeologies that follow themes. They can be really endless. And where you stop is always going to be arbitrary. So I'll stop here. What I hope is sort of draw those arbitrary boundaries in a bit of a new way. I've managed to maybe materialise something beyond sort of magic string by which imperial ambitions are realised. And I hope it's got a lot more people in it. I hope it feels a bit more than a tool of empire. Here's bibliography for anyone that wants it, and do let me know if you'd like a better copy of this, because obviously that's very small writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cassie. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. That was good fun and very thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Lots of questions, and people have put them in the text box down the bottom.
I'll
I
open up the chat.
put them out for those who aren't looking at the questions. Where are we going? Yes. Oh yes, Stuart Ash, who used to work at the STC days in Greenwich, and is still an international cable consultant, says first chairman of Telcom, John Pender, was a major shareholder in the Chile copper company in Chile, and his eldest son, to Emma Dennison, was sent out to the mine manager to replace the mine manager who died. So yeah, there was a very close.
I didn't know about the mine manager bit. That's new. Thank you.
Well, I can give you Stuart's contact details if you like, and you can follow up with
Oh,
him.
that sounds fun.
Stuart has written a really good book about John Pender, called Cable King.
Yes, I've read it.
Okay, okay, well, talk to Stuart then. Elizabeth, who's on our committee, says it's something that, yeah, Elizabeth knows about this. Elizabeth grew up in Cloomphill. She says there was a gutta-percha works in Cloomphill in Greenwich, but it seems to have got bombed in the First World War, so there's not a lot, there's no sign of it. Nobody seems to know where it is. Elizabeth, do you want to elaborate? Have you got any more information?
Yes, Alan, I know where it was, and it continued as municipal industrial buildings until about the 1960s.
Right.
And so far as I don't know when the gutta-percha works continued until the damage was repaired. It was damaged in 1917.
Right. Okay, which was when there were a lot of Zeppelin raids on London. I think that there was the first real Zeppelin raid was about 1917. Okay. Bill Burns from New York says Chesterton compound is still used today for voicing reed organs because it's easily applied to the reeds.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
But Bill always has things I don't know. That's why it's so good to have him here.
But there we are. Mick Dillap, it says, are you in touch with new developments in Valencia?
No, tell me about them.
Mick, go on. You're still here?
Well, there's a new cable museum being created. Valencia, or the Irish, are applying for new status, world heritage status, based on the cable. And it struck me that obviously there is a colonial element to cable relations with local Valencia, which
Very much so. Yeah.
very much so. Yep.
It's everywhere you look. But I mean, I guess the point of the talk today was to try and show how different it was, because we quite often use the word like colonialism and it seems a bit blanket and there's no detail. And so it means something so different in so many different places. But yeah, there's always aspects when you've got sort of uneven relationships and money coming from one place. Yeah. So it'd be very interesting to find out what's going on there and how they're thinking of portraying it. I'd love to know. Thank you very much, Mick.
Cassie, are you doing work on the current telecoms industry and where things like...
Could you say that a little louder?
The current telecoms industry. I mean, where a modern subsea cable, where all the components come from and that.
It would be fascinating. I was down at the Porthcurno Telegraph Museum today looking at all the fibre optic cables they've got down there, and you know, they've got that one big display where all the cables from earliest to latest are all in one cupboard, and you know, I'm sort of going through and thinking, yeah, I know what that one's doing. Oh, we're getting a bit complicated. And yeah, there is definitely a moment sort of about 1960s where my knowledge rather tails off, and it would be a fascinating project.
Yeah, because I mean, some people have done some work on things like mobile phones and the rare earths that go into those, and into...
Well, I did that, yeah. So mobile phones I've got covered, but I haven't ever done anything on optical fibres, which is odd because they were sort of discovered. What's the guy's name? Is it Kay? He's from Harlow, STL in Harlow. So all the early optical developments took place like just up the road from where I grew up, but I didn't know anything about them. So yeah, it'd be fabulous to do that.
Yes, in fact, I was doing a talk to two of my new colleagues at work today, and I talked about the development of optical fibers, and Charles Cow, and
That's the name.
who died about 10 years ago, got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2009, I think it was. Yeah, and now there's now a data center on the old SDL site in Harlow. I didn't know you were a Harlow person.
I'm Northfield by the airfield, so pretty close. But yeah, I whole new corner of the world I need to investigate. No idea it was so close to home.
Alan, you shouldn't just talk about Charles Kao. George Hockham was just as important in the research. I know Charles has been the face of fibre optics ever since. That was because when it became famous, George Hockham had already died, but it was a joint thing.
Yeah, and of course you can't get
the other thing is that we wouldn't have the capacity of submarine cables without optical amplifiers, and that's based on erbium doped fibre, which is another rare earth, which that will make some countries that have been very poor very rich in the future, because sources of erbium are not that prolific.
I guess as long as they maintain control over them is the issue, isn't it? Because as soon as anything sort of rare earths turn up, all sorts of people move in.
Exactly. It's still international money comes in and grabs it, but countries have a better control than they did in the 19th century that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
And to bring it back to Greenwich, of course, repeaters of the last bit of technology that they do at Alcatel submarine networks in Greenwich, I guess, isn't it?
Plus the power feed and all the transmission equipment.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, lots and lots to do.
The front end. I mean, obviously these days, submarine systems are what they call open systems, where the owner of the system can slap on any transmission equipment that they want to. In the past, it used to come as a package, where you'd have the transmission equipment and the power feed and the bits that went in between bought under one contract. Now they just buy the submarine part, and then they put anybody's equipment, Cisco, any of the people who are developing very high bandwidth and bit rate equipment for terrestrial stuff can be sent over submarine cables. So it's slightly different market model now.
Yeah, and the data centers have turned into cable landing stations and things like that. Yes, okay. Few more comments. We've had a lot of comments.
Actually, Stuart's comment about sustainability and gutta-percha is really interesting. The reason I was down in Cornwall was to meet a new PhD student who's starting. It's Exeter, and my PhD hat on at Bath Spa, new student of mine, which is focusing on pre-1915 issues of sustainability in the company records, with the idea that teasing out those very early ideas about scarcity and sustainability, but obviously not in the words that we would use, sustainability. So yeah, I mean, it's always been 1915 is kind of the date because of the establishment of the plantations, but people like Cerulus writing in the 90s, and Purcell with his Purcellite, and all the alternatives that people are trying to conjure up for gutta-percha that completely fail effectively until Cerulus works out his maceration methods. The PhD is going to be looking at a lot of that and sort of how companies position themselves in terms of resource scarcity. So quite a sort of economic history's take on it, but it looks like it should be good. And she's actually from Malaysia, the student, and has worked on all sorts of Japanese and World War II archives previously. So with any luck, she should be able to pull out all sorts of really interesting stuff for us. So yeah, one to watch. Say again, sorry?
If you want to link to that piece of information, the Telcon story has a chapter on it that was published in 1950. So
yeah,
if you haven't got a copy,
no, I've got a copy. You're all good.
Oh, yeah, I bet you've got loads of books and you just don't know where to look to pick these things up.
It's the earliest snippets that we're interested in.
Right. Malcolm Tucker says the Silvertown cable works you said were destroyed in 1917. Might that have been the famous Silvertown explosion in 1917? Do you know, Cassie? Or
Can you say the first half of the again? It's a little bit quiet.
Yeah, there was a
very
famous,
quiet speaker.
famous explosion in Silvertown when a munitions works exploded and killed lots of people. And you said the cable works in Silvertown was damaged or destroyed in 1917. Was that, Malcolm Tucker says, was that the same explosion? Was that the same?
The Silvertown explosion is quite a long way up the peninsula, much more towards the dome than the Silvertown works ever were. They weren't particularly badly affected there by the Silvertown explosion, no. It doesn't reach so far. I mean, they get broken windows, but that's kind of it. So no.
Hey,
Yeah, I can confirm that. The peninsula took much more damage than the Silvertown works, with the gas holders, one of them being completely destroyed. So it was further upriver.
No, it wasn't.
Well,
I've got the photographs. I've got the photographs of it, Stuart. It wasn't completely destroyed.
It was just bent, it was bent out of shape though, wasn't it?
It was bent out of shape, yeah. And they cleared it out, you know. But I've got the pictures.
Yeah,
weirdly, my great uncle's jobs was painting the gasometers in the East End. That's all they did all day, every day, just go round and round and round painting gasometers. They were the Bush brothers. Did you ever come across them in the archives?
It'll be interesting.
The Bush brothers. They just painted gasometers.
Was Cassie, were there any health risks for handling it? Just, you know, I'm aware of similar tar products.
I mean, they're carcinogenic.
Huh?
They're carcinogenic.
Yes, okay, fine.
But quite frankly, the people that were having to handle them didn't really have lives long enough to get cancer and worry about it. You know, that was the least of your problems in a lot of those situations. I think the tar in Sweden is quite well set up. It's not a particularly messy enterprise. I mean, they still do it today, and there's very little spilled. Yeah. That's quite efficient. But I think turpentine dipping is an entirely another matter because of the way they were asked to live on the land. So if your only access to water is to drink turpentine contaminated water, then yes, of course, you're imbibing things. Though at the time, that was seen as quite medicinal because it killed parasites on the exterior of people. So it was used for taking ticks off sheep and all sorts of things. And so it was felt that drinking a bit of turpentine was quite good for you and it would clear you out. No, if you want to go to the most traumatic health implications, it's actually the jute. So not the growing so much as the factories when you get to, I mean, we've all seen the life expectancies for Dundee factories, it's like 39 or something dreadful. If you look at the Collicut jute factories, you're far more likely to be injured in the factory session, processing the jute with all the fibres in the air and the heavy machinery than you were in the retting. So, but you know, jute's probably the most lethal bit of that. That and mining the copper, probably pretty close.
Yes, okay. Thank you for that information about the Big Dipper. I'd always assumed it was some sort of fairground entertainment that the Big Dipper was named after, not...
Oh, no, the Big Dipper is exactly the same. It's a very straight-sided ladle because you don't want a tippy one, you want to be able to get in there with it. So it's a particular shape of ladle, the dipper.
Does the gutta-percha industry still exist? Somebody pointed out that a lot of people have it in their teeth. I used to have it in one of my teeth when I had a canal treatment, but then I lost the tooth, so I don't anymore. But I was able to talk to the dentist when he finished playing with my mouth, so I knew what gutta-percha was. Yes, exactly. So, are there still any uses for gutta-percha?
Yeah, gutta-percha is still used in dental implants. I mean, it's kind of unrecognisable in that it's coloured and purified, and you know they do lots of. I mean, the reason gutta-percha is great is it's so inert in the human body, but they do plasticise it and they do add and take away little parts of the compound to make it more amenable to what they want to do with it. But you can still buy them. I bought them off the internet. maybe 5 years ago, I bought a big pack of dental implants. They look like toothpicks and you sort of melt them in place. Because I was doing a baby experiment with a tiny bit of cable and I wanted to have some gutta-percha. So I thought I'd try that. And I also bought some sort of antique broken Victorian stuff as well to try various processes with that. Yeah, no, it's still very easy to get hold of.
Yeah. I got a gutta-percha necklace for my wife when I did a talk for Greenwich Industrial History 2 years ago. So and there's a picture of her wearing it. Yeah,
Nice.
and
obviously you've got all the ebonites where they've used the heat process to make gutta-percha not be malleable with heat, so that then it stays in place. And then you see it all in the telegraph insulators. There's some lovely ebonite insulators. So it all joins back up.
Richard Sylvester says, I think we need 9 o'clock. We need to close in a minute. Was A&S Henry the jute tacking company in Greenwich connected to the cable manufacturer? I think Mary
Looking for the
that their site was close to the telecom site.
I'm looking for the chat because I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh right. Yeah. Was Greenwich A&S Henry, was that connected to cable manufacturer? Do you think?
That's a very good.
I don't think about Henry at all. I know they were there. I don't think about the history.
Yeah, there are various Henrys that are on the Silvertown side. You know, that name crops up, but I don't know if it's some sort of little spin-off or.
It's Henry, not Henley.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I misheard there.
Yeah,
I
Henry.
know-
The cable company still existed. He got taken over by GEC.
Yeah, no, Henley's is definitely there, but I don't know about the other one. So can we save these chat questions so I can go through them?
Yes, yes. They will be. I think they're savable. Somebody, Caligaro says, could you comment on the pre-telegraph semaphore technology? Have you done anything on that?
I can a little. So, I mean, one of the reasons that we get the submarine cables that we get is because of the optical systems that were in place previously. So, for example, the reason Porthcurno is hit upon particularly as a landing place for cables, even though it's very much out of the way and would be very traumatic. I mean, A, it avoids deep ports, but there's originally there's a landline that runs to Porthcurno because there's a ship, a hulk, moored out in the channel there to look for ships coming past so they can notify Falmouth and onward ports. So the big reason that Porthcurno's there is because the optical semaphore goes to there. If you look at the sites between land telegraphy and optical telegraphy, they're not actually looking for the same thing though. What optical telegraphy wants is big hills in the landscape effectively. And what land telegraphy wants is really easy ways of buying long thin strips of land. And so there's a big tie between land telegraphy and railways, but not much overlap between, let's say, the Admiralty lines or the Shap lines on the continent. You know, they don't seem to overlap much in terms of useful service.
They need big hills about 20 kilometres apart.
Yeah, that's what they want. all of them are called Telegraph Hill to make life easier. It's very handy.
Richard, you want to say something? Richard Sylvester?
I was going to let you know that A&S Henry were suppliers to Telcon, but I don't believe there was any shareholding between them. So they were a supplier because obviously Telcon used a lot of Hessian sacking.
Yeah.
Right.
Everybody used a lot of Hessian sacking. It was just so totally ubiquitous. It's like the carrier bag, the pallet.
So bag.
Okay, any final question? This has been really, really good, Cassie. And thank you, Mary, for booking Cassie to do the talk today.
I think we started about 4 years ago now, so I'm glad to be here finally.
I think I'm always open to suggestions. In fact, I'm going to chase Mick about Valencia, I think.
Yeah, that would be really good.
You know, because you can do it from home in Bristol rather than trek up to Greenwich and Blackheath. Okay, well, thank you very much. Any more final questions before we close? I will be processing the video recording of this as soon as I have time, which I think over the next couple of weeks, I'll probably have more time than I have over the last few months, as work is easing off as the run up to Christmas. So I'll try and edit it and put it on our YouTube channel over the next few weeks. But I'm not going to commit to any date. But it will be there, and I'll put it on I'll put a link on the Facebook group as soon as it's up there. So, but thank you, Cassie. That's the Richard Sylvester says bibliography. Do we request to?
I will send it. If I send it to you, Alan, you can disseminate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cassie. I will send it, and on everybody's email addresses I've got, of course, so I can then circulate it. So thank you very much.
Malcolm was putting a hand up. I don't know if he meant it or not. Malcolm Tucker. No?
No. Richard, do you still want me to say something? No. Okay. Well, Cassie, thank you very much indeed. It was a brilliant evening. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it
It's absolutely brilliant. Thank
Great-
you. Really,
great
really
talk.
fascinating. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Now, goodbye.
Bye.
Right.